Let's talk about questioning or koan practice. How does one use questioning and integrate that into meditation? What's the usefulness of it? How does one do it? And how can it actually bring you to an awakening experience? So we've talked about multiple ways to practice so far. We've talked about mindfulness practice where we're using labeling. We've talked about a mantra practice where we're using repetition. A questioning practice is actually using a question. So when we talk about questioning, you could be sitting there and you could be doing any practice, whether it is doing rising and falling, which is a mindfulness labeling practice, or you could be doing something like a mantra, like Kwanzaa Bosai. As you do that, sometimes your practice gets a little bit stale. You start to get kind of used to it, and it starts to become stale. But let's think about what are the motivations. Why do people meditate in the first place? People could meditate because they want more physical health. People could meditate because they want actually more focus or they want more clarity. But what about meditating to actually wake up to who you really are and to actually start to abide in this potential of who you are? What about that? What about meditating to find out the answers to life and death? What about those things? These topics that some people talk about, but most people actually feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about. If you were to really be honest with yourself, really expose that soft, gooey center, you would probably say that there's something not quite comfortable inside your heart. Something that is yearning a little bit, something that doesn't quite know who you are and your place in this world. If you're very honest with yourself, you might experience that. Okay? So then, how can questioning be used to really start to probe into that, to start to bring that to the surface, and then to start to let that culminate? And culminate into what? Culminate into an awakening. Awakening into what? Awakening into now. Awakening into who you are, into the reality of life as it is. So when we're meditating, let's talk about how we can use questioning in each of the different kinds of meditation we've talked about so far, and then we'll talk about using questioning only. So if you're doing like rising and falling and labeling practice, one very simple question you can ask yourself is, who is this, or who am I? So when you're doing rising and falling, you can say, okay, who is breathing? Or who is saying rising and falling? Who is meditating? Who is this? Who am I? You can just bring it up from time to time. And when you do, it actually makes you slightly curious. You're like, okay, that was a little weird to think about. Then you go back to your practice. If you're doing your mantra, Kwanzaa Bosai, you can ask yourself, okay, who is chanting? And when you say that, your mind kind of slows down a little bit and it gets a little bit confused because it's a question that we all take for granted. Who am I? But we never really sit with to understand that question. So let's take that question and let's start to look back on it a little bit. If you were to ask yourself, who am I? Let's be serious and let's see what would that experience be like for you. You can try it. So when people say, who am I? What happens is their identifications come out, right? I'm a man, I'm half Asian man, I'm a half American, half Korean man, I'm a doctor. All of these things, I'm a father, I'm a husband. All of these things that we start to identify with come out, okay? But if you add all of those things up, does that make you, the totality of who you are? And you say, well, not just that, it's also my body, my DNA, also all of the memories that I've had in my life and all the experiences, all of that up. Okay, so take a second. If you add up all of that, and you ask yourself very sincerely, is that enough? Does that really feel like who you are? Does that fill the void that's in your heart? Well, I would say it probably doesn't. Okay, you're going to have to experience that for yourself. You have to go through this unpacking where all this identification gets looked at. I'm not saying it's true or false, right or wrong. That's up to you. I don't care about your beliefs. What we care about is helping you basically do three basic things: heal, wake up, and abide in awakening. So as you're questioning, who am I? The mind starts to become a little bit more confused. Okay, when it starts to be more confused, it starts to stop taking things for granted. So we say that in an expert's mind, there are very few options. In a beginner's mind, There are many. If you already know who you are and everything about life, then you think you're an expert. There are very few options. You already know so much. A beginner's mind is this mind that does not know, that is open to possibility, that has fresh eyes and can see and experience life. So this questioning process can really start to work back into our preconceived notions, the things we take for granted, to have us look at that with fresh eyes. And not only that, it starts to give us a lot of focus. I had a Zen master one tell me it's like a gaping maw that just swallows up excess thinking when you start to really put energy into being there with your questioning. Who am I? In the Zen tradition, they cultivate this questioning. They cultivate it in a koan practice. So a koan could be something like a Zen riddle. For example, the sound of one hand clapping, which is a famous one some people have heard. I like to start with what is your original face before your mother was born? So when you hear that, what is my original face before my mother was born? It's a confusing question. It kind of gets the mind to sit back a little bit and ask and ponder a little bit, because it's outside of what we expect. It doesn't sound rational or logical. You get this, it kind of slaps the mind. So if you were to sit with that question, what is my original face before my mother was born? What is it? What is it? Then that question starts to become more in the foreground and starts to become more important to you. That is if someone gives you a koan in your life, and you can work on that with a teacher. Oftentimes koans, if you're just going to read it in a book or something, they have quizzical stories and they might seem interesting, but they often require some kind of back and forth with a teacher to help get some guidance. But let's take this original question of who am I? Maybe the original koan that applies to everyone's life. Who am I, right? What is the purpose of this life? So this who am I, as you're asking it from time to time, as you're doing either your labeling practice or your meditation practice with your mantra, it can start to take more of an importance to you, and it can start to come more into the foreground. And then maybe it starts to become the focus of your meditation. Just who am I? Who am I? You start to drop your other practice and you just start to pick up this practice of who am I? So who am I? You breathe in, who am I? You breathe out, who am I? Okay? You could even slow it down. Who am I? And then eventually what's left is just the question word. Who? Who? Or what? Instead of who am I, you could say, what is this? What is this consciousness? What is this body? What is this life? What is this? What is it? What is it? And you get to what we call the word head, or just the question. Who or what? Just stick with one, who. So as you're doing who, it starts to elongate and stretch. And then as that happens, what happens is your mind starts to collapse on it more. Who, and you have less thinking of other things and less distractions, and it starts to become more important to you. So why is there tremendous energy and fuel behind questioning? Well, some people say that questioning and this doubt is comparable to the fear of death. What is death except for the fear of the next step, the fear of the unknown? If you all knew that everything was going to be gravy after death, if you had just seen it a bunch of times and you saw literally that people exploded and joy came out of their bodies and went to heaven, you would say, I'm not going to be afraid. I've seen this. This is easy. This is easy. But nobody knows. And because nobody knows, we have all this tremendous discomfort and fear. So when you ask yourself a question like, who am I? You're starting to experience this lack of understanding or this lack of real knowing. So this small doubt starts to grow into what we call the great doubt. And this great doubt can have the same experience or the same amount of impact as this fear of death. And with that, what's experiences is a tremendous amount of focus and energy. So if we were to talk about what does it take for someone to actually have an awakening, most of the time what happens is we are distracted in our lives. Things are happening to us. we're chasing things. We're chasing money, chasing women, men. We're chasing fame and power. We're chasing comfort. We're always chasing things or running away from things. I don't want to have that conversation. I don't want to be around that person. I don't want to be in this situation. We're saying more or less, more or less. So when we start to question, this more or less starts to relax. And as it starts to relax, you start to have more energy to just really be present with that doubt. So if we were to say, for example, we're on the earth, it's like a rocket. When you don't have a lot of fuel, you can only go up so far before you come back to the earth, right? You only have so much desire to actually wake up to the reality of your life, because what happens is your job pulls you down, your family pulls you down, your desires pull you down. But if it came to you and there was no other desire, there was just this desire to actually know, this desire to experience your true self, this desire to wake up. If you could let go of distractions, then you start to have this tremendous amount of fuel in this rocket. And as this rocket ascends, it starts to hit the atmosphere, and there's a lot of tension. But once you break through the atmosphere, this false idea of who you are, this ego, there's a relaxation. It becomes easier as you start to experience life with freedom and joy. But you come back to the earth, right? Because the fuel runs out and eventually you get back into earth. We're not going to talk about the experience of awakening or what happens after awakening or how to integrate awakening. That's not the purpose of this conversation. The purpose of this is actually to talk about how can we integrate questioning into your practice. So who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And then you get some focus and creates a bit of tension. So it's very useful if you're working with a teacher to have a back and forth when you start to do real koan work or real questioning work. In the beginning, it adds a lot of spice, we'll say, or a lot of reinvigoration to your practice, because you start to make it personal. Whether you're doing meditation, you're doing a mindfulness practice, or a koan practice, when you interject it from time to time, it makes you sit up a little bit, and you actually have a little bit more juice to work with your practice. Oftentimes, when people start meditating, they want to meditate just for a little bit of clarity of mind or something like that. But as you sit here, your body opens up, your heart opens up, your mind opens up, and your sincerity starts to become a little bit more in the foreground. Then this questioning will start to get behind the matter. And then it'll start to bring out all of these other things that are residing in you. All of us have the potential to be a fully realized human being. Okay, what does that mean? It's something you have to experience, something you have to actually transform into. I think that we can acknowledge that the habit energy pushes us to act in a certain way. And some of these actions, they're uncomfortable and they cause pain for ourselves and others. And they all have consequences. And we don't feel our lives are experienced with the full freedom, the full joy, and the full compassion that they could be. So as we practice, if you take it as a spiritual discipline, if you want to use the spirituality word, if that works for you, then questioning can be a strong practice that gives you a lot of fuel, to give you a lot of presence, to touch that great doubt. That doubt, which is what we call the gateless gate, the barrier between you and a true experience of life. So what you can do with that is you can integrate that into your everyday life also. You're driving your car. Who is driving? Every once in a while you ask yourself. You're cutting vegetables. Every once in a while you ask yourself, who's cutting? Or every once in a while you're doing your work. You say, who's typing? And as you do that, it'll make your mind much more present, and this doubt will start to grow a little bit. Okay? There's much more we can start to talk about as far as what happens when doubt grows, and how to use that doubt when it becomes strong, and all of these other questions that happen. But that's often very useful to talk to a teacher so you can have a little bit more one-on-one personal experience with. So what we're going to do is just do a little bit of an intro. Okay? So let's paraphrase what we've talked about so far. Whatever your practice is, even if your practice is just breath, or your practice is rising, falling, your practice is mantra, Guanzin Bosai, Guanzin Bosai. Every once in a while you can ask yourself, who is doing this action, right? Who is breathing? Who is labeling? Who is chanting? And as you do that, your mind becomes a little bit more focused, a little bit more present. And as this question becomes stronger in you, you can bring it up more and more. Who is this? Okay, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And then the word and all of the question and all of the strength of it starts to really coalesce there in the who. Who am I? Who is this? Who am I? Who? And you can start to feel an intensity build up with that process. Okay? If that experience starts to become uncomfortable, then what you do need to do is you need to start to find a teacher, someone who can speak with you. There are resources on the internet, there's places that you can go and people that you can talk to, because the mind, as it starts to separate from its preconceived notions, there's confusion, right? There's always this experience of rebirth, and it doesn't mean that you're reborn into a new body or reborn into new circumstances. It's just that there's this identification that we take for granted. I'm a man, I'm a half Asian man, I'm wearing a gray shirt, I teach, I work, I do these things. And then as you say, well, that's not the totality of who am I, who I am. Then really, who am I? Then this identification starts to relax. So they say in Zen in the beginning, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. Which means, oh, we know what's going on. We understand the world. Mountains are mountains, rivers are rivers. Then you start to practice, and what happens is mountains are not mountains, rivers are not rivers. So this identification, if that's not all that I am, if I'm not just only a man, if I'm not just only a doctor, if I'm not just only a father, then who am I? Then there's some confusion. Mountains are not mountains, rivers are not rivers. The mind is experiencing cognitive dissonance. It's a necessary stage in this transformation, this awakening, this passing through the gateless gate. And then with awakening it says, mountains are mountains again, rivers are rivers. So then you emerge back into your life, and what happens is these are some things we're just going to have to take for granted right now, and let's see if we can agree. Would you say that human beings, ultimately, if you drop the noise, if you didn't have all of this encumbrance in your mind, in your heart, that there is a sense of joy there? Okay, you probably have experienced it from time to time in your life. But if you do drop that, you'll experience a sense of joy. And also, when you see a situation, and if that situation needs help, you'll experience a sense of compassion. Okay? These are innate qualities of being human. Also, as we look across this earth and we look across our life, we can experience a sense of freedom. Freedom to actually create. This form has a function, and it's a creative function. So these are qualities of a human being that we can really experience, and we can move forward into potentiation. Mountains are mountains, rivers are rivers. Oh, I'm starting to question. I don't know what's going on in life. Mountains are not mountains, rivers are not rivers. I actually woke up a little bit. Mountains are mountains, rivers are rivers again. And a very famous Zen master once said, mountains are mountains, rivers are flowing. This rivers are flowing is this purpose. How does one live your life now that you've experienced life as an awakened person, is now that you've seen the truth? Now what do? You do something, you have a function, right? We bring our lives back into the world and we add something with our unique creativity, right? A Zen expression could be, if you see someone hungry, give them food. Okay? So this unique creation is something that we all need to ask ourselves, what are our innate gifts? For example, I'm a doctor, so I treat patients. That's one of my gifts. I know everybody does something different. But the experience of being a human being is identification coupled with relaxation of identification, a transformative process, awakening into the reality of existence, fully utilizing who we can be with all our creative process. Sounds simple, right? Sounds amazing, doesn't it? Wouldn't you like to live life like that? Well, to do that, you're going to have to let go of some identification. So let's practice. All right? So once again, bring in who from time to time. Who am I? Who is doing this? Like, who is it that's using the toilet? Who is it that's having a conversation? And as that who becomes more in the foreground, becomes more important, becomes stronger to you, and you start to really experience your sincerity coming out, and with that you're going to start to experience a little bit more strength, because what we do is we cover up that sincerity with fear. And as you stop being so afraid, because this desire to know starts to become more important than the fear, this desire to awaken becomes more important than the fear, then you're going to start to ask the right questions. You're going to be more present. And it's very useful to find a teacher. Okay? I hope this was useful for you. Let's practice with that, and tell me how you do.